Treasury is sticking to its guns about implementing the carbon tax for next year, 2016, dashing the hopes of business that there might be further delays to this unpopular measure it believes will add another burden to an economy already reeling from load shedding and low growth. Now, the proposed tax will hit heavy emitters such as Eskom, ArcelorMittal and Sasol very hard. The carbon tax could add significantly to their revenue at a time of fiscal constraint, as the Treasury estimates it could generate between 8 billion and 30 billion rand a year, depending, of course, on the final allowances and exemptions. Now, to discuss this further, we joined in studio by Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University's Business School. Professor, a very good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Good morning, Elvis.
First and foremostly, this carbon tax move, is this a move in the right direction from government?
I think the point of departure has got to be that every country must have a climate change policy, an environmental policy, and we in South Africa have one, and in some respects it's at the cutting edge of what the world wants to do about climate change. So one must see the carbon tax as only a part of a much bigger picture. So what we say about environment and about climate change goes beyond the carbon tax. Now, we must bear in mind that the carbon tax was originally proposed 5 years ago, and there's been quite an intensive process of consultation over that period. I thought at the time, yes, in principle, maybe that needs to form part of the total package. But now I think one has grave doubts, given the changes over the past 5 years, which really fall into four categories very quickly. The first is our economy is much more vulnerable, far more weakened. We're almost in a perfect storm, in a way, as far as our economy is concerned. Low growth, the whole Eskom saga, the load shedding to which you have just referred, the Eskom tariffs, xenophobia. The whole picture says, look, we are dealing with a very different economy, one which is much more vulnerable. Secondly, we have introduced other measures over the past 5 years. There are some important regulations in place which control the environment. We've imposed levies on electricity. It was recently increased in the budget. We have a carbon emission on cars. So we haven't been idle. So the question is whether after 5 years you still need to do something more, given the state of the economy. Third is, yes, it's wonderful to be at the cutting edge of developments in climate change when you can prioritize it. But if you now have other priorities, like trying to get this economy going, then you have to say, well, there are some things which are nice to do, but we don't have to do them now. We may have to wait. And finally, of course, the point you made, there is the suspicion, which has been denied, that really at the end of the day, it's the 30 billion rand that matters, not the climate change. So I must say my own view is that there is a groundswell that says, look, maybe not yet, that we should really delay it until we've got other things sorted out. And in fact, since the global crisis, a lot of other countries have also taken their view. They have new priorities, such as getting their economy going, and then to come back to these issues which may impose unnecessary burdens at the wrong time.
So there is a suggestion that we should look at a review of the carbon tax policy.
Well, fortunately, there is an opportunity for a review. There are three opportunities, actually. The first is that the draft legislation will be published, and of course the Treasury will call for comment. And I think everyone should take that opportunity, whether they're in favor of the carbon tax or not. I think it's an opportunity. Secondly, that legislation will then go to the relevant standing committee in Parliament. There's another opportunity for input. And then finally, what is important, of course, is that the Davis Committee on Tax Reform has indicated that it too wants to have another look. Well, it hasn't had a look yet, but it will now have a look and be part of this whole review process of looking at the carbon tax. But its deadline is the 8th of May. So if anyone out there wants to make input, they must do so quite quickly so that we can influence the decision or the design or say, look, let's leave this for a while. Let's get on with the other urgent things that this country needs to address. This is perhaps the issue of of a carbon tax is perhaps not the most important issue to absorb the country at the moment.
Let's look at the carbon tax in its entirety. Are there any possible negative economic and social impacts that it might have on South Africa's economy?
Well, I think the feeling is, just to come back to my basic point, you have to take these decisions and float them off on a reasonably strong economy, especially if there are other things you have to do in respect of climate change and environmental issues. Mm-hmm. The problem is that when you're only facing a growth rate of between 1 and 2%, when you worry that 1 out of every 3 South Africans doesn't have a job, when you're talking about wanting to lift more people out of poverty, mm-hmm. that's not the time to talk about new taxes. I think we must just be very careful. Mm-hmm. We're already in a fairly tight fiscal ship. And the Minister of Finance is trying to do a good job, both to control his spending and not to put up taxes by too much. Because the point comes where this is completely counterproductive. Mm-hmm. There is now a trade-off in the way there was not before between, say, a carbon tax on one hand and your growth and employment and the other things you want to do. It now becomes a more stark choice. And the risk that you may do damage to the economy is much greater than it was 5 years ago. And I think all this needs to be considered during the course of the year before we arrive at our final decisions about a carbon tax.
Now, Eskom will be affected negatively by this particular carbon tax, but the IMF and both the World Bank commented on Eskom's situation in relation to South Africa's economy. Can you unpack this just briefly for us?
No, well, that's very important because, I mean, one of the biggest, of those who are CO negative is Eskom. And you also listed a few other companies, but don't bluff yourself that somehow you can shift this onto Eskom or onto Sasol, or whatever it may be. It ultimately is passed on to the public in one form or another. So we are all concerned with the carbon tax, and we must understand we already have enough serious problems about Eskom, which have been highlighted by the Reserve Bank and by the IMF. We don't want to add to Eskom's problems a carbon tax as well.
Just briefly, in 30 seconds, Prof, your message for us.
I think the message here about the carbon tax is simply we must all use the opportunity this year to make our inputs. We have the opportunity, the National Treasury will be receiving these inputs, and so we must be prepared to say, whether you're in favor of it or against, make a stance and say, let's ask ourselves whether at this point in time, imposing a carbon tax on the South African economy is the best thing to do.
Professor Raymond Parsons, thank you so much for joining us here in
you.
studio. That was Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University Business School joining us right now.